We're going to get kicked off with Tobias Ellwood. Now, he was on the World at One, is it? I can't remember what the Radio 4 lunchtime news programme is called yesterday. And frankly, some of the things that he had to say were quite spectacular, because he's basically demanding that the UK gets into direct war with Russia. Let's have a listen to this first clip here.
Do you agree with Professor Clark that the UK should be sending these tanks and more?
Oh yes, absolutely. This is our war, but we've left the Ukrainians to do the fighting. It's not just the morale, the moralistic issue here. It's the fact that Russia is now pushing this against the wider West. So I very much welcome the fact that we're now sending, or thinking about sending, main battle tanks. It does show how far we've come in our willingness to look Putin in the eye and not be spooked by his rhetoric. I hope we will now see other main battle tanks, the Abrams, for example, the German Leopard. This is what Ukraine needs if it needs to be able to sort of regain and hold territory and push Russia back.
Okay, and your expectation would be that if the UK moves, it'll just be the first mover because others would follow.
Well, absolutely right. And we have been too risk averse. We've lost that Cold War statecraft to look at Putin in the eye. We need to recognize we should not be leaving this to the Ukrainians. Absolutely, Russia is up for this fight. They can endure hardship much better than the West. They're retooling civilian industries. They're mobilizing tens of thousands ready for a spring initiative. We need to be thinking about what 2023 means to us.
So, Alex, I'm just interested in your thoughts on this. What does 2023 mean to us? And he said very much there, if Britain leads the way, others will follow.
Mike, he has just encapsulated in a paragraph a century of British statecraft to contain Russia. I'm going to sound like some conspiracy theorist out of the Kremlin now, and we're going to be featuring Patrushev later, who's often being accused of that. But he said it all, hasn't he? The Brits use Johnny Foreigner, but Johnny Continental is not so hard anymore. But the Ukrainians are still hardy fellows. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you would read in the 1960s in a British Army training manual for what to do when you come up against the Reds. You know, in those days it said the Red Army contains a high proportion of countrymen and hardy fellows. And here is Ellwood as if it's still the 1960s, really. He hasn't got the memo on the last half century. By the way, moralism. He said that we shouldn't be, or we should be moralistic, but we should go beyond moralism. Moralism, or being moralistic, is a narrow-minded concern for the morals of others. What will the Americans say?
Well, I was astonished, Mike, as I think you could see by my face as I watched that clip. What is he, lacking the mental acumen to make the right decisions, or he's a dangerous idiot? I think it's the latter.
Well, look, remember how I captioned him, chair of the Defence Select Committee, 77 Brigade. Remember, he is still a serving 77 Brigade Lieutenant Colonel.
Well, I'm going to say, no, he's not a proper officer. In my book, this man is playing at the job. But what is he talking about? Short of the UK going nuclear, we have no conventional capacity to do anything with the Russians or in the Ukrainian conflict at all. And to send 10 tanks is an insult to the Ukrainians. So Tobias Ellwood should be ashamed of himself. And if this is the quality of the military that we've got in 77 Brigade or elsewhere, then Britain...
We're in trouble.
Yeah, we're in trouble, absolutely.
But it gets better. Let's have a look at this.
The Russian Security Council Secretary has just been talking about basically saying Russia is now fighting Nato in Ukraine. Should that uneasiness about the sort of perception of that just be gone?
I'm sorry, who are we being warned by? We should not listen to this rhetoric. We should have more confidence in ourselves to stand up to Putin. This is the theatre of operations is in Ukraine. We should be stepping forward. NATO essentially has been benched. We should be doing far more to put this far out, and we're not doing that. Further on the strategy side as well. We should be looking to establish a weapons factory in eastern Poland, for example, so they can procure their own equipment.
What does it mean for the UK's military readiness? We give, 12, we're upgrading the tanks. Do we need tanks, or are they only ever going to be used in this form of proxy warfare?
Well, you're right that we are now absolutely involved in the proxy warfare, and we should raise our hands to that. We should also recognise that the world is getting much, much more dangerous. And we are still on a peacetime defense budget. And the last integrated review that took place a couple of years ago actually slashed our capabilities in our army, our air force and our navy. It's due to be resubmitted, to be reviewed in a couple of months' time. We need to increase defense spending to 3%. We've entered an era of insecurity. That's where we're going now. The idea that this is just going to, the flames in Ukraine will then die down and we'll all go back to normal is completely wrong.
So you'll notice there the COVID-like language, because we get the buzzword, the era of insecurity, but there's no chance of going back to normal. So to get that word normal in there. But Alex, we've got an acknowledgement there that this is a proxy war.
I would have thought that was a great departure from historic practice, Mike, for anyone involved in military policy to admit to a proxy war. I mean, anyone who's roughly of your generation and mine, there's not that many years between us, will remember that history textbooks at school talked about proxy war as being the nasty underbelly of the post-1945 Anglo-American peace, the Pax Americana. And now it's being openly admitted to, but not by the Americans, but by the Brits.
What did you think?
Well, I think this man is unbelievably dangerous if he's talking about an era of instability. That instability has been caused by his ilk at work, causing trouble in the world, inflating Ukraine in all sorts of areas, which we can discuss a bit later, and ultimately throwing the Ukrainians at the Russians. So if we want to sort the world out, what we need to do is remove people like Tobias Ellwood from the political scene.
Well, let's look at a bit more insecurity then and bring the three stooges here on screen. There they are, Charles Michel, Ursula von der Leyen, and who's that in the middle? Oh yes, Jens Stoltenberg. And this is because the third NATO-EU declaration has been made. That's really impressive. So Stoltenberg, Michel and Ursula von der Leyen together yesterday signing this. They resolved to address growing geostrategic competition, resilience issues and the protection of critical infrastructures. Other priority areas of work will include emerging and disruptive technology space, the security implications of climate change, foreign interference and information manipulation. But here was the key thing, because during their statement, or during Jens Stoltenberg's statement afterwards, he said the NATO-EU partnership will become even more important once Finland and Sweden become full NATO members. The question is Sweden ever going to become a full NATO member? Because the Swedish Prime Minister, very upset at Turkey. So he's saying a day or two ago, Turkey has confirmed that we have done what we said we would do, but it also says that it wants things that we can't do, that we don't want to do. So that's what he's saying. He went on to say, sorry, that's a duplicate, but nonetheless, in the meantime, in order to sort of get round this problem, Alex, the Swedish have decided that they're going to go into a joint US-Swedish defence cooperation agreement. The negotiations are beginning, as announced by the Department of State in the United States a couple of days ago. So this seems to me like Turkey putting requirements on Sweden before they get membership, mostly related to the Kurds, but Sweden wanting to press ahead with closer and closer ties to the United States nonetheless.
Yes, of course, the Swedes have a very close intelligence relationship with the British and the Americans anyway. They're, like a number of continental countries, almost in the Five Eyes. They're just one step down from that, but they're militarily very capable. Turkey is very well known for throwing its weight around. It's a couple of years ago been practicing ethnic separatism in its ministerial visits to the Netherlands and Germany. Now it has the chance of its lifetime because it gets to veto an accession. But there are people, including quite high up people in the US, not in the administration, but thinkers like John Bolton, the nicknamed the Walrus, who've openly been calling for Turkey to be kicked out of NATO and have said that de facto it's already behaving much like France under de Gaulle, as though it weren't a member. Possibly one resolution will be that Turkey is edged out in order to bring Sweden in. But short of that, as you've pointed out, America can do what Britain's been doing with several continental countries and form a bilateral association whereby they are in military union with them anyway.
Indeed. In the meantime, in Poland, here they are. This is the Polish defense minister. He has announced the formation of a new army division. It's going to be stationed along Poland's border with Belarus. Well, here's what they're saying. They're seeking to saturate eastern Poland with troops. Our task, he said, is to build a strong Polish army to effectively deter an aggressor, to make sure that the aggressor doesn't dare attack our country. Here is the Polish government announcement. Let's do a quick translation on this. The formation of a new division of the Polish Army, the 1st Infantry Division of the Legions, has begun. Deputy Prime Minister, this is the 5th tactical, this is a quote by him, this is the 5th tactical union in the Polish Army and the land forces of the Polish Army. The division will be equipped with modern weapons. So what are they talking about? They're talking about South Korean K9 howitzers, Polish-made Gladius reconnaissance and attack drones, also Polish-made Crab self-propelled guns, and so on. These are what they're describing as modern weapons, but nonetheless, they're looking at ramping up arming and militarizing the eastern border.
Indeed. Okay, well, let's move on, if we may, to the BBC's reports on Soledar. Where am I going for that one? Oh, thank you. And well, quite remarkable. UK column talks about the subjects, and I've got to say we've been able to do that due to the excellent reports coming out from another whole range of social media reporters. But shortly after UK column's report on Soledar, the BBC is forced to actually put out this headline, Ukraine war, Russia controls most of the pounded salt mine town Soledar. Forced to put out the statement, but as we'll see, the BBC still squirming because it doesn't like the truth about progress on the battlefield. So let's see how it constructs this. Soledar, which had a population of around 10,000 before the war, may be seen mainly as a stepping stone to capturing Bakhmut, and its strategic value is questionable. Well, this is of course absolute nonsense, because Bakhmut is very important in its defence of the eastern Donbass, and as we'll see, the Russians have taken every effort to break through. The article went on to say that Russia is unlikely to take Bakhmut. Well, this is a ridiculous statement. Meanwhile, senior military official from the US Department of Defense said on Monday that there was a good portion of Soledar in Russian hands. Well, at the moment, Soledar is essentially captured. There's a small escape corridor, but Soledar is in Russian hands. Fighting around Bakhmut has been going on for months, said the official, and what he did describe correctly is that the exchanges on the battlefield were savage. But here's the BBC doing what it does best with media, which is distracting the audience onto minor issues. So at the end of the second paragraph there, we can see 2 British nationals have gone missing. We did talk about these 2 on Monday. They were last seen heading towards Soledar, where the fighting has been unbelievably intense, and now at the moment nobody is sure where they are. But this of course is the human interest story which the BBC is using to distract the reality of what's on the battlefield. So if we move on to this report from a few hours ago, the BBC is now attempting to draw everything into, well, we don't quite know what's happening on the ground. So the BBC, with its multi-billion-pound budget, doesn't know what's happening in Ukraine, but social reporters from Ukraine, Russia, and of course the West absolutely do know what's happening. So if we just come back to the UK column report on Monday, the key point we were making was that Bakhmut is a key strategic strong point for Ukraine. The Russians have attacked it by taking Soledar in a flanking movement, and the Ukrainians have killed ultimately thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers trying to reinforce Bakhmut. And the situation is that the Russians are now punching through this line, and the secondary Ukrainian defence lines, which you can see there around Sloviansk in the north, but effectively it's a circular area of much smaller urban areas. These are considerably weaker. So the BBC, totally unaware this is taking place on the battlefield, but on social media, the Russian advances are being accurately mapped, and you can see what's starting to happen. Of course, Bakhmut is either going to be flattened with more loss of life for the Ukrainians, or those Ukrainian forces are going to be fully encircled and captured. Here's another map showing the Russian progress on Soledar and the circled in blue Ukrainian reserve strong points, but these are much weaker positions. And on the right, I've now inserted on the screen pro-Ukrainian social media support showing the red, which is the extent of the Russian advance. And excuse me, and the key thing to remember is that the remaining Ukrainian defences are increasingly vulnerable. So let's bring in this report, and this is where even Ukrainians now can see the reality, where it's being reported here that the situation in Soledar is terrible. Russians captured more than half of the town and are encircling what is left at the same time. Ukraine needs a massive counteroffensive here, or it's lost, which would likely result in a domino effect, more areas lost soon. Well, it has been lost. But even if we look at the UK Ministry of Defence, we've still got attempts made to play down what's actually happening on the battlefield. So the UK Ministry of Defence doesn't really give much on Soledar. Its capture, well, it's gone, and that means that Bakhmut is going to go. But the Ministry of Defence continually playing down the reality on the battlefield. Alex, I've got a couple of film clips which I'm going to show of Russian reinforcements, but it is incredible that Ministry of Defence in UK now has simply become part of the propaganda machine of Ukraine.
Indeed, and this has been going on for over a decade beforehand, like so much of the build-up to the war. But the Defence Intelligence Service, based at Whitehall in the Ministry of Defence, used to enjoy the universal acclaim of its American, much bigger equivalent, the DIA, for being extremely accurate and cautious in its assessments. And that was my experience in the decade of the 2000s. Then they were chopped to size, at one point literally being told, sack as many men as will not fit into the new building, where the old one was sold off for a hotel. Northumberland Avenue, I think that was. And this has just gone on. And on the slide you just showed, 2 of the 3 points are forecasting with the adverb likely and unlikely. The DIS just didn't do that until recently. It assessed the situation on the ground.
Okay, thank you for that, Alex. Well, let's just have a look at these couple of film clips. We'll show these on screen, but I'll talk through. Of course, what we're seeing is the vast amount of Russian equipment which is coming into the area. So on social media, many people have been taking film footage showing huge trains with weapons, heavy weapons, tanks, field artillery, and clearly coming with soldiers and munitions. So this simply goes on and on. And at the end of the day, to say that Russia is running out of capability is pure nonsense. Whereas if we go to the reality of the fighting, and I've only just given a very short clip here, of course, we've been told for months that the Russians are running out of artillery shells. This is a picture of reality on the front. Very lucky for the people in the vehicle that they didn't get close enough to this incoming round. But the reality is that Russia is using some immensely powerful weapons, and as a result, we are seeing huge numbers of tragic casualties on the Ukrainian side. Now, how is UK helping this bloodshed? Well, let's go to the MOD again to have a look at a training film for Ukrainian soldiers in UK.
It's the very first time for us being in the United Kingdom. But in just a couple of days, just by building those interpersonal relationships, we became as a family, a big family.
Project Spring Generation. We are delivering training for people who are going to be fighting in a few weeks' time, and there's a real sense of purpose behind that. The training of a number of Ukrainian Armed Forces personnel to operate 6 different vehicle types: the CVRT Spartan, Mastiff, husky, wolfhound. Anything that's got a gun, anything that's armoured is trained here in Bovington. Bovington training area is really unrivaled anywhere else in the UK.
The training area and the training facilities are outstanding for us, meeting all our expectations and even overpassing them. I expected it to be very difficult and complicated. They enjoy pretty much everything, just being in another country. Training-wise, whatever we're asking to provide us to better meet our expectation, everything just boom and done. It's so easy to work with you. And I do appreciate everything what you guys do in your country doing for us, and this particular organization is doing for my particular organization.
Well, Mike, I don't know what you thought about that, of course, with the emotive music, but I find this a tragic film because ultimately what is going to happen to those men is they're going to be killed on the battlefield. Mercenaries in Ukraine are now talking about the fact that the new troops with minimal training from Britain or elsewhere are simply being killed as they come into the frontline sector because they're still utterly unprepared for the scale of warfare. And of course the officer there talking about six different types of vehicles, so this is complete nonsense. How are the Ukrainians going to be able to handle all these different types of vehicles? And to say that we're going to give them 10 Challenger tanks in order to fight the Russians in the Donbass is outrageous. So if we have a look at these innocents on screen, here they are. They're going to be sent back to Ukraine, and the result is going to be that within a few weeks they are going to be dead. And they're going to be dead partly because they will believe that they've been trained to take the Russians on in the scale of warfare that's taking place in the Donbass. Some of our viewers have already commented on the massive explosion that we showed in the earlier video clip. And of course, Putin is now saying he's going to use more of what he calls the special weapons, which are proving so effective at breaking down the Ukrainian defences. So, Alex, I think you've got a few words to say here to the Ukrainian people.
I have, and I said this first in our Christmas special, but if we bring that slide on screen, I will reveal the message because it's very apt given what we have just been seeing, which is Шановні українці, ми глибоко співчуваємо ваші ситуації, але ви повинні розуміти, що західні пропагандисти вас експлуатують. So, dear Ukrainians, we profoundly sympathize with your situation, but you have to understand that you're being exploited by Western propagandists. And I'm thinking very much of the kind of extremely sincere officer whom you just played at Bovington training area. Clearly, he's not been given a script. I'm well used to listening to Ukrainians and their spontaneous use of English. The man clearly meant what he said, but I think what you said just after playing the clip is true, Brian, and it's an example of what's plagued both the Ukrainians and the Russians during this last year of warfare. They've now had such a wedge driven between them that they incorrectly assume they understand each other, being brother nations, and their assumption of mindset and capability is just on both sides far apart from reality now. This gentleman, I don't doubt his hardiness or the men serving under him, but he's woefully unprepared for both the mindset and the capability of the Russians, and he's been to a large extent brought into a British mindset. So this one actually is an illustration of the same problem from the other end, perhaps. Argumenty i Fakti is a kind of Russian paper that we don't have an equivalent for in Britain. It deliberately tries to bring the masses highbrow thinking. Here they have interviewed, and for this we give a hat tip to Alexander Mercouris, who mentioned this just after the half-hour mark on his last YouTube monologue last night. Patrushev is the long-serving chief of the Russian Security Council, and before that he was the head of the Russian Security Service, the FSB. And he's very close to Putin, obviously in the running to succeed Putin, if it turns out to be someone of Putin's own generation and circle that does succeed him in due course. What he's saying in this interview, the headline that Argumenty i Fakti has given to it, is that they, the Anglo-Americans, and he calls them the English in the article as well, they are trying to reduce Russia to Muscovy, to its medieval status. We've seen in Ukrainian maps on the wall of the chief of military intelligence there that thinking is now being parroted in Kiev as well. Let's bring that back on screen and see what kind of things Patrushev is saying. This is from my translation software, because after you tipped me off to this, Brian, I didn't have time to translate it myself, but I verified this against the original Russian in my own translation software. 4 highlights. First, Patrushev is asked, are you saying that even the American authorities are not pursuing independent policies, that is, as a government? Patrushev replies, actually, or in fact, the American state is just a shell for a conglomerate of huge corporations that rule America and are seeking to dominate the world. For these transnational corporations, viewers might like to read Ian Davis's material both on ukcolumn.org and elsewhere to understand the global public-private partnership. Patrushev says, for these transnationals, even US presidents are mere extras who can be shut out, as was done to Trump. All 4 assassinations of American presidents, I think he's referring to historic ones going well back before JFK, are linked to the corporate trail, or he may be referring to the 1960s wave. It is no coincidence, says Patrushev, that a growing number of Americans are declaring that Republicans and Democrats are just 2 actors in the same play, one which has nothing to do with democracy. He goes on to say that Americans have a national debt of over $31 trillion. England's debt, he says Anglia, but then a lot of Russians and other people in Eastern Europe just refer to Britain as Anglia, but he may be significant here. But he's saying England or Britain's debt of £2.4 trillion has become the highest since the Second World War and has exceeded 101% of gross domestic product. Namely, if we tried to stop all spending for a year and just pay off a debt, we still wouldn't manage it. Japan, he says, which is now being turned anti-Russian as we've been reporting, Japan, with its public debt of almost $10 trillion, set a world record in the debt to GDP ratio. It amounts to more than 2.6 times as much debt as product. Only those countries is better English, only such countries as consider themselves masters of the world are not going to pay those debts. Patrushev goes on, and I'll pass it back to Brian and Mike for comment in a moment. In a world undergoing drastic change, corporations are aiming to maintain a system of global exploitation. At its head is an elite of businessmen who do not associate themselves with any state. It's sounding like your and my talked at Alternative View, isn't it? And I know that Patrushev's accused of various conspiracy theories, including within Russia, but he has more and more weight to it. Underneath this, what Ian Davis would call the global public-private partnership layer is, according to Patrushev, the so-called developed nations of the world, and then what the Russians often call the Zolotoy Miliard, the golden billion, the happy few of the world. And then there's the rest of humanity, contemptuously referred to as the third world. The interviewer says, so according to this logic, it seems Russia doesn't have a very enviable place in the hierarchy. Patrushev replies, there is no place for Russia in the West. Russia irritates a bunch of world powers because it has rich resources, a vast territory, intelligent and self-sufficient people who love their country, its traditions and history. Much of this is true of Ukraine as well, gentlemen, to be fair, but we seem to have harnessed that. Finally, and I won't read the whole of this, but with a nod to the kind of thinking that Matthew Ehret is popularising, that the potential of mankind is far from exhausted, which was made into a subheading by the article, the journalist for Argumenty Fakti said, let's get back to these transnational corporations and the influence they have on national governments. You're saying that it's an almost limitless influence. What are their methods? And then, well, perhaps to break the monotony, either Brian or Mike might want to read some of that, and then you can comment before we go on.
Right, okay. Let's have a look. These methods are the most cynical. Some of them are experiments with dangerous pathogens and viruses in military biological laboratories, which are supervised by the Pentagon. They're unceremoniously engaged in moral corruption of the society. We'll be talking a bit more about that later in this news. The West has mastered the zombification of people by means of mass propaganda and now aims to use cognitive weapons, influencing each person with the help of information technologies and neuropsychology methods. We can't fault this, Alex, because this is accurate, this is true, and indeed the UK column has been, I'm going to say, leading in warning people about the psychological attack on people living in UK and the West. We've been doing this for a great many years. So it's remarkable that this man, whatever we say about him, is coming straight in on the button, describing who we should really be fighting, which of course are the people that are implementing these policies in the UK, the US and the West.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The whole Russian thinking society, the whole of former Soviet society before the rivenness we got over Ukraine, was talking about this concept of the golden billion, and they've long seen City of London and Manhattan plots to reduce Russia, and in their own territories in the West and in the suzerains of the West around the world, to reduce population. And Patrushev says in this piece, whether you look at the sexual agenda or the genetic manipulation agenda, and they've been saying this for years, it's all about population reduction. And even if you take it a bit more conspiratorial and say that some people are expecting some kind of astronomical event and others are expecting a real pandemic of untold magnitude, whichever route you go down in trying to work out what's in the heads of the people who pull the strings of Western governments, I think this essentially Russian thinking is more and more correct, that at the end of it, whatever nefarious agenda you think there is, the thinking is with a lot fewer people, we could make this system work. Even the financialization of digital identity seems to be ultimately predicated upon the idea of far fewer people in the world. But let's move to France, in fact, picking up on the British press, because one of our alert French viewers has noted that, and I didn't see this in the Daily Telegraph itself, but a Telegram channel in French, Hervan Castel, has already quoted the Daily Telegraph as saying that it's France that's kicking off the next moves towards an open Third World War. And they're picking up particularly here on France's decision to send the Ukrainians some of their wheeled tanks, because this is the freeze time of year when the roads are impassable in Ukraine and Russia, and France is attempting to obviate this, or allowing the Ukrainians to, by sending the AMX-10RC, which are chars à roues, so they're non-tracked vehicles, supposedly better able to cope with the slush and mud and nascent snow that's on the ground. And the Daily Telegraph, as picked up by this French channel, is saying that Macron, by sending these, has crossed red lines. He's crossed the Rubicon, violated the military taboo, and has become the first Western leader who has decided on such a step. And then in his own words, Hervan Castel adds, whether the puppet is Sarkozy, Hollande or Macron, France remains a major actor in global chaos and conflagration. And this overlaps with what Mike was presenting a bit earlier, but Le Figaro, in its international section, has already picked up on yesterday's Brussels meeting. Both the EU and NATO are headquartered in Brussels, so they had a home match, as it were, when they met yesterday. And what they're picking up on is that the decision yesterday, Tuesday, the 10th of January, was to give the Ukrainians whatever they think is necessary. And a separate French news report, which I don't have on screen, is quoting Stoltenberg as having said, presumably yesterday, that weapons are the road to peace. That's as Orwellian as these things are now getting. The French press is also picking up on neighbouring Germany sending its foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, of whom we've been reporting a bit lately, and her making her third visit to Ukraine since the war started. She's chosen to make a symbolic visit to Kharkov, the second city of Ukraine, very, very close to the Russian border, and hence also to the front lines of Russian troops. And she's decided to make Kharkov the symbol of Ukrainian defiance. In fairness, I know we're often accused of favouring Russia in our coverage of this war. Kharkov has had a lot of mass destruction of black blocks of flats, and it gives the lie to one extreme position in the war, which is that Russia has only done targeted precision bombing. I think hundreds of thousands of people have become homeless as a result of bombing. The question is whether Russia was militarily justified in bombing targets and what was being held at those locations. But there has been a lot of desolation there. And if we bring that back on screen, the conclusion of this piece says that this is the third time that Baerbock has gone to the Ukraine since the invasion last year. Her first visits were to Kiev and to Bucha, where a lot of Westerners pay pilgrimage now because it's become a kind of accepted dictum nostrum that it must have been the Russians who did all the war crimes there. So that's so much for France. We'll move on to Germany because viewers are tracking also what the Germans are giving. So just to point out to viewers who wish to focus on this, that IFW, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, has a Ukraine support tracker. It's intending to bring facts and substance to the debate on support in the rest of the world for the Ukraine war. So here they're expressing government commitments to the Ukrainians in terms of a percentage of the gross domestic product of the country. And the real heroes in this scheme are the Estonians and Latvians, who are getting on for 1% of their whole GDP being given to Ukraine. Obviously, Lithuania, Poland, Norway, and the United Kingdom are in the next bracket with around 0.5% of GDP. Below them, Scandinavia, well, actually, it's North America first, and then most of the rest of Europe. The further you get from Ukraine westwards or southwards, the less fervent the support. But that's actually based on a Kiel working paper, the Ukraine support tracker. So people may find that a useful website. No doubt it will be in the show notes ere long. Zooming in on Germany, I have a little screen capture here. The German federal government in English has got a page on military support for Ukraine. I do love this faulty English here, which reveals a thing or two. At the end of that page, it says so-called security capacity building. They don't know how ironic that sounds in English, but it's not intended to be ironic. I'll just start this playing. This is what's been delivered already to the Ukrainians by the Germans, and anything which is in bold is changes compared with the previous week. I may have to hit that once more in order to start the video playing. I beg your pardon, that's now going too quickly. Perhaps, Mike, you can start the video playing there. We're going to see that there's 70mm rocket launchers, pickup trucks with rockets, armoured recovery vehicles, transporter tractors, many pickups, generators. It seems perhaps the video is not going to work, but believe me, it's a long list. You can find it from that page. And the second half of the page is planned deliveries, and that's equally eyebrow-raising. However, as Brian has reported before with reference to Britain, there's an undue emphasis on giving the men sleeping bags and military winter clothing. And the really cutting-edge stuff is in very small quantities, even from Germany's stocks, because 10 years ago, Germany slashed most of its stocks of main battle tanks and the like. So more symbolic, perhaps, than real. But we'll go on to the final slide of my segment here, which is regarding the effects of the war as being reported in the BBC. So first of all, from a coal mining area of Germany, Lützerath, the BBC is reporting a standoff between the police and protesters on the site. And it's the nebulous tie into Ukraine, which the viewer spotted. And you'll often find that the word amid is used in a headline to try to glue together things which really are chalk and cheese. So they're talking about, they in a throwaway line, they admit that there's been a standoff between coal mining advocates and coal mining detractors in Germany for years in sites, including this one. But here, how's this for a piece of BBC editorializing? Russia's war on Ukraine has given it a greater significance, transforming it into a national symbol. The viewer wrote this. There is a report about this in North Rhine-Westphalia. The item is under the label Russia-Ukraine war. It has nothing to do with the war, says the local. The mine is already huge. Until a few years ago, we lived in the small village of Matsarat on the other side of the city. As the mine expanded, the villages, some with medieval churches and buildings, were completely destroyed. So this was Germany increasing its coal mining output, much to the chagrin of some Germans, the protesters, even before the war. The viewer says the villages were built anew and the people were moved, school, church, everything. They even put the new name in the new village and called it Neumatzerat. When we asked why people were not protesting, because at that time they weren't, we were chillingly told that the few must suffer for the many. This was entirely internal German politics. An autobahn has been moved at least twice and been built along a new route. We return each year for a few weeks and we always wonder where the autobahn will have moved to this time. Meanwhile, the war has real effects in far-flung parts of the world. Jubi, an Indonesian news site, is reporting that the provincial government of the Indonesian province of West Papua, formerly known as Irian Jaya, is asking people to anticipate a food crisis. There's the acting governor on screen, Paulus Waterpauw. He's got a Dutch name because the Dutch were the colonial power there. Mr. Waterpauw has said that the land is a gift from God. It mustn't be sold. It's better to make the most of it to face the multi-dimensional crisis that may occur this year. And the Indonesian president has said the same. The governor has said that Papua must be alert to face all possible crises, especially food crises due to the war between Ukraine and Russia. If the crisis continues, says the governor, there's a possibility that food exports can no longer be carried out, so people will need to prepare land planted with crops that can be consumed and harvested in a short time. The provincial government is preparing regulations to encourage people to utilize idle land. It does seem that they, on the other side of the globe, they understand more of the real situation than we do in Europe.
They've got less of our media, I'd suggest, Alex, to answer that one.